Have you ever watched Night at the Museum 2? If you have, you've heard of the Smithsonian. It's a real place in Washington, D.C. that houses all of our history, which is why it's so important that we learn about it. I have done extensive research on this place. I've even been here too. So some of the museums that we will be discussing today will be the National Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of the American Indian, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Now that we know about the basics of this place, let me tell you about my first point of interest, the National Museum of Natural History. The first exhibit that you see when you go in here will be the African elephant exhibit. In fact, the first thing that you see when you go in here will be an African elephant. His name is Henry, and he is brought in by a Turkish hunter. But if you're more interested in butterflies, there is the Butterfly Pavilion. A Voice of America article said that there is over 50 species of butterflies here. That is a total of 300 to 400 butterflies here. In fact, the National Museum of Natural History says that it is a climate-controlled place at a constant 80 degrees. This means that the butterflies are happy and healthy and will live a long time. It is also handicapped so everybody can enjoy it. But if you're more interested in the humane side of things, there is the Ancient Egypt exhibit as well. There are 3 human mummies here, and human technologies let scientists observe these mummies while still preserving them, keeping them safe and sound and healthy, sort of. There is also the Hall of Mammals exhibit. Animals from all bouts of life are here, from an eastern gray squirrel to an okapi, a now extinct mammal. You can even stick your hand in a squirrel burrow to see what it would feel like. The National Museum of Natural History teaches us so much about the world, from African elephants to the Butterfly Pavilion, ancient Egypt, and the Hall of Mammals. Now that we know about world history, let's look at my second point of interest, the National Museum of American History. So many artifacts from our past are here, including the women's suffrage movement. There are over 60 artifacts in this exhibit, including a portrait of Susan B. Anthony. Now, this exhibit may be temporary, but it is important because it shows how women had to fight for the right to vote. Speaking for equality, there is the Greensboro counter from the Greensboro protest. This occurred in February of 1960 when young African American teens protested by sitting at a diner that was segregated. Now, there's also the original Star-Spangled Banner here as well. It flew over Fort McHenry in 1814. It also inspired the national anthem today. The National Museum of American History gives us so much, especially from the women's suffrage movement with the portrait of Susan B. Anthony, the Greensboro counter from the Civil Rights Movement, and the original Star-Spangled Banner. Now that we know about the American history side of things, let's look at the more indigenous side, bringing on my third point of interest, the National Museum of American Indians. This museum has 3 exhibits. The first one talks about the Inca Empire and how the greatest achievement was the engineering of the Incan Road, and how the legacy lives on today in the native tribes. The second exhibit, it talks about the philosophies of natives, from the Pueblo Santa Clara to the Anishinaabe. The third exhibit talks about the government treaties that have been had with the American government and the native people of America, and how we continue to break them today. The American Indian Museum gives us so much about indigenous culture. It talks about the Inca Empire, the philosophies they have, and the government treaties that have also been had with them. Now that we know about the indigenous people of America, let's look at my fourth point of interest, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The United States Holocaust Memorial website says that this is a living memorial to those who suffered through the Holocaust. The first exhibit is titled The Nazi Assault. It talks about the rise of the Nazi Party, as well as the outbreak of World War II. It also discusses the policies put forth against Jewish people, like Kristallnacht and the Nuremberg race laws. The second exhibit here is called The Final Solution. It talks about more policies put forth to Jewish people, like ghettoization and even concentration camps. You also hear testimonies from Auschwitz survivor. The third and final exhibit in this place is the last chapter. It talks about the liberation of the Jewish people and the rescue attempts of it. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum discusses some of the worst atrocities committed in recent history. It shows us what these people went through, from the rise of the Nazi Party to ghettoization and concentration camps to the liberation of Jewish people. Now that we have learned about those who have suffered through these atrocities, let's look at those who have built this country and still have had to fight for equality in it, in my final point of interest. The National Museum of African American Heritage and Culture. This museum gives us so much for African American culture. It teaches us how rich this culture is through artifacts. The first artifact there is a slave shackles. They have 2 loops in them with a metal flange on the end to keep them from breaking out. This was used on slaves that were traveling or being sold. The second artifact is a dress that was made by Rosa Parks. It is a flower design, and the belt is the exact same design as the dress itself. The third, and one of the most amazing artifacts here, is the lace shawl that was Harriet Tubman's. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery and helped so many others escape it as well. This shawl was gifted to her by Queen Victoria in 1897. The National Museum of African American History and Culture teaches us so much about them. It shows us through artifacts like slave shackles, a dress made by Rosa Parks, and a lace shawl by Harriet Tubman. Now, I have told you just about a few of the museums that the Smithsonian offers. The National Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of American History, the National American Indian Museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Remember the next time that you find yourself in Washington, D.C. to immerse yourself in the history of the Smithsonian, not just the political climate. Thank you.